Hey guys, Henning and Morten from FlippedNormals here. In today's video, we are going to be showing you how to make really cool cinematic looking renders inside of Blender using Eevee with cameras and path constraints.
This is going to be a lot of fun, so let's jump into Blender.
So this is kind of what we'll be creating in this tutorial. So we used the same techniques when we created this Thanos project before, and using these techniques, I think, allow you to create really dynamic and cinematic renders, which is kind of the point of all of this. But just to show you what you can actually create with this one, we thought we'd show off a little bit in the beginning. So let's jump into Blender. Here we have, this is our pre-made Thanos asset. I guess it works out to use Thanos for pretty much everything because he's such a cool character. But the essence of this relies on cameras and paths. So to start off with, let's create a camera just there, and then we are going to be creating a curve like that. And now the simplest way to do this is to take your camera, you select your camera first, you shift select your path, and then you hit Control P and you add a path constraint. And now the camera is constrained to your path. If you click on your camera, go to the constraints, you can see if you play around with the offset value, it just goes in an infinite circle basically. So one thing you want to remember is when you create a default camera here in Blender, it comes in with values already on it. So just hit backspace to clear those. So now we have a zeroed out camera that can follow our curve, like so. Another thing you want to do is enable follow curve. That way it's being tracked to the curve and sort of follows the curvature. Without follow curve on, it sort of stays in the same orientation. So hit follow curve. The next up, for the camera, we want to get some specific values here. The first one here for X is going to be 90 degrees. We just sort of like rotate this up. And the other value is going to be minus 90 degrees for the C plane. That way we have a camera that's focused on our subject. I mean, if the subject is in the center of this curve. You can do this with other kinds of curves as well. I just think the circle is a nice, it gives you nice smooth shapes basically.
It's very easy to do and it gives you really nice results in no time at all.
So one thing you have to keep in mind when using this technique is that these kinds of curves, especially the circle here, comes in with edges. Like it's not a perfect circle. So if you just select our curve, go to the curve properties here, and you can see that the resolution is set to 12. And this actually affects your render. For example, here, if I just set it to a very, very low number and we go back to our constraint, you can see that it actually hits each corner and then continues to travel. So we want to eliminate that as much as possible. So usually I'll just come into the properties here and just give it like a really high value. You're probably going to have to test this yourself depending on the speed and the scale of your scene. It's all kind of scene dependent. Okay, so now that it's constrained and we have a smooth curve, then we can actually start to think about our shot. All right, so we want to light this in a, again, cool and cinematic way. That's kind of the whole point of this. So let's start by first positioning our camera down here maybe. And then we want to start thinking about lights. So lighting in Blender is, I mean, it's really fast, especially when you use Eevee. I tend to stick mostly to area lights because they give you a sort of flat or flatter lighting plane that's very predictable.
I very rarely use anything but area lights. The lighting can be harsh or it can be soft and you can really easily control it. It just looks good.
So just rotate this a little bit and then play around with these intensities. See, okay. I mean, already there, it's a pretty cool lighting, I think. But for this, I actually want to focus more on the infinity gauntlet, but we still need some general lighting in the scene. So this is where you kind of have to start thinking about what do you want for your scene. And for this one, you kind of have, I guess you have to light every scene, you kind of have to light with intention. It's not just about throwing in lights there and see what actually works. So for this, our focus will be on the gauntlet.
Yeah, when it comes to lighting, you really can't just light a scene. What kind of lighting you use is entirely dependent on what you do. When you're lighting a scene like this, well, any scene, you have to start with what do you want it to feel like. And in this case, we want it to feel like cool and mysterious.
Yeah.
Which means that, then we need stuff to be in darkness. If you want something to be mysterious, well, you can't show everything because then there is no mystery. So then you'll have a third in shadow or something like that, but keep the emotional quality in mind when you are lighting.
Yeah, so that's why the first light here that we put in front, which is kind of hard to see now because it's the dark background, this is going to be our key light. Unlike a traditional key light, which would, maybe look, something like this, or maybe even like this, that illuminates kind of the entire scene, we're kind of trying to keep it a little subdued because Thanos himself is like the secondary element. The main focus is going to be the gauntlet, right? So we're trying to create this gradient of light down to the gauntlet. That's why he's not super illuminated. Another thing that we can do is add something like a rim light back here over the shoulder. Rim lights tend to be really effective at showing you sort of the contour of whatever you're trying to light.
I know it's like a bit of a meme that every CG artist uses rim lights for absolutely everything, but there is something to it. It's not just that you do it because it's lazy. You do it because it's effective. It separates out the forms from the background, and it makes it really easy to read what's going on. So
let's take this. And so these are going to be like the main lights for I guess Thanos, just to outline his shape. And then I want to take this one light, I'll just duplicate it. And I want to shine this. I want it to be lower intensity but closer. And then I'll shine it directly at the gauntlet. That way we sort of have this direct light that illuminates the main focus of this scene.
I love the way of rotating the lights like this when you're like rotating based on screen based.
Yeah, if you hit R, it like sort of rotates around this axis, which I guess is hard to explain. If you hit R twice, you can sort of do it based on where your cursor is moving. It takes some getting used to, but I think once you got it down, it's really efficient, especially for lighting. Okay, so now we have some basic lighting with 3 lights. We kind of have 2 key lights, one here, which is our main key light into the gauntlet, and a sort of secondary key light that illuminates the top of the gauntlet and Thanos and gives us this cool gradient across the metal and across the chest, as well as the rim light just in the back, just to illuminate this a little bit. Now these aren't colored lights at all, these are just white lights. You could add some color to them, but I don't know, for this, what we're doing right here, I think just having neutral lights will work just fine.
What's important when it comes to lighting as well is that you keep it dead simple. Use as few lights as possible to get the job done. It's very easy to overlight something and overcomplicate it. Now,
one thing that can be annoying for some, me in particular, if you're lighting something and you're trying to do it in shot, basically, like here, you're looking through the camera, you have a slight 50% opacity of a frame around your camera. This can be easily fixed if you go to your camera settings and go to I think it's called pass part out, I don't know, and just hit the slider up to 1. That gives you a completely black frame around your subject. That way you can just focus only on what's within the camera frame. I tend to get distracted by whatever is around there.
Yeah, this is essential to have enabled.
So now that we have the basic setup going, we can start playing around with what we actually want. And for this, I want a sort of 90-degree turn that tracks up along the gauntlet, right? So we want to start the camera from here. You can obviously play around with this, but again, just like with the lights, I think it pays off by trying to plan it out a little bit, like plan out ahead and think about what you actually want. So maybe from out here.
Yeah, you don't want to do like generic lighting for the character because you will always do scene specific lighting.
Yeah,
you can do like maybe like a base lighting, but you're always lighting based on the final cameras.
So one thing to keep in mind is when you're using this kind of workflow for creating cinematic shots is that everything that you move, right, you move it based on the curve here. So you can move the curve, like translate it, you can rotate it, and you can also scale it. So it's a little bit different than working straight in camera, but it means that, at least for me, I find I have more control doing it this way. So we go back to our camera and then we start doing the 90-degree turn. So first off, I'll right click and say insert a keyframe on the offset. Then I'll go maybe like 200 frames and we'll go to maybe the front here. Again, you will have to tweak this to figure out exactly what you want it to look like, but now we're just kind of approximating. So here you can see, okay, we get a cool move and it's very smooth because we're following a curve, but we're obviously too close to the subject now. So select the curve, hit the N key to get transforms up, and then set a key for both the scale, insert keyframe. I should actually do that on frame 1, not frame 200. You can do it this way as well, but
yeah, you can do it like this and you can move the frames.
Yeah, it's just more clean if you do it from frame 0, 1, whatever. Here, insert a keyframe there and insert a keyframe here because I also wanted to track up basically. So we'll be adjusting the Z value. Then we go for the 200 frames, the length of our move. Select our curve, hit G, Z, and then sort of move it up. And then we can see we end up around there. And I'm also going to scale it a little bit just to track out. And then I'm going to right click on both of these and insert a keyframe. Now I can see that I actually wanted to move over a little bit more. So maybe something like this. Replace, right click and replace. And then we can also always go in, hit the G key, and then maybe move it over a little bit so the gauntlet is more in frame. Maybe go down a little bit like this. Remember to right click and replace keyframes. Now we have our basic camera move. So let's just preview that real quick. So now it tracks from the side. Because the curve scales up, it actually goes out, it zooms out a little bit, and we end up here. Pretty cool. It's very basic, but I think with this kind of workflow and mindset, you can actually start to create some really cool and smooth looking shots.
One thing I recommend doing as well is, always use reference of what you want to do. A good way of finding reference for this is to look into commercials. Look into like product shots for latest iPhone or whatever it might be, because that's what this is. You're basically making an iPhone commercial now, just with a god who snaps galaxies in half.
Yeah, that's basically. So
Thanos commercial.
Looking at it from back here, where we'll be ending our shot, I can see that we're still missing a little bit of, let's call it depth, because we're going all the way around the character, right? So just add another light here and try to position that so it sort of hits the top of the shoulder as sort of a secondary rim light. And then maybe increase the intensity a little bit.
Can you have too many rim lights?
I don't think so.
For a Thanos, I'm not sure if you can.
Not in VFX. So some things you have to consider, right? For a shot like this, because it's taking place in a dark environment with metal, it tends to, because the metal reflects whatever is around it, it's very dark. So let's try and manipulate the scene a little bit. So we'll take a light like this. This will be a little bit finicky. I don't know, like a very, very low value. Another thing to keep in mind with these area lights is that the scale of the light actually matters. Like the smaller it is, the more intense it's going to become in a very specific point. You're basically turning this into a point light by scaling this down. If you scale it up, you distribute the intensity, the power of 5 watts across this entire plane, so it's going to appear weaker. That's just a good little trick to keep in mind, I suppose. I want to have something here. Something that just gives us a little bit of rim, but doesn't reflect too much back on the chest either.
Now, this is where you got to be careful. If you start off with these small lights, then you're going to be in trouble very soon. You need to work from general to specific, get the overall emotional quality down, get the main color scheme down, and then you can start to add these different kinds of lights as well.
Yeah, and you want to be careful with this, especially once you start adding more and more lights. It can quickly become too much and start to look over-engineered, I'd say.
Yeah, like the way I see it is kind of like you lighting away yourself into a corner where you just have no idea what's going on. When that happens, and it will inevitably happen to everyone, then I disable all my lights and I just start again. Turn them on one by one.
That's a really good idea, actually. So for this now, I think we're actually in a very good spot where we have a little bit of rim from our tiny light here, some additional fill light with this light, and then the two key lights, one of Thanos, one of the Gauntlet, and the two rim lights. It's still, I guess, low on light, especially because we want to art direct this a little more, but good to keep in mind. So let's just try to play through this. So now we track up the Gauntlet, we can see the fill light really gives us this nice reflection all the way across. And this is the basic approach, the sort of fundamental approach to how you would do any kind of smooth cinematic shot inside a Blender. Now, I want to take it a step further and combine this with something else. So you can see right now we're restricted to just this move going from side to side. You could, for example, when you're doing your track up, where we're moving in the Z direction, you could also go in and animate something like the X rotation to get it to track up even more. That can be a bit finicky because you're not always sure where your focus is going to end up. So to show you a different method, let's just hide these for now. And then we'll create a different one. It follows the same principles where we'll create a camera. We will create a curve, just a circle. Let's move the circle into place, kind of in the same place as before. But let's say this time we want to focus on his face. So select the camera, select the curve, Control P, and select the path constraint. Now the camera is constrained to our path, as we can see here. And then now comes the interesting part. We want to add an additional constraint to this. We want to add a track 2 constraint. Now you can see right now the track 2 constraint just goes straight to the center of the scene. My scene is a little skewed, so the center is right up here. Now the track 2, it takes like an input. It wants to track an object. So you could track his head, you could track the gauntlet, you could track, the bicep or whatever, the entire arm, but it tracks a single mesh or a single object. So what I like to do is I like to create an empty, and I'll do this in the form of a cube because it makes it easier to see. Scale it down a little bit so we have, I guess we can better see where we're actually focusing, and then I'll sort of put it on his face. And we click on the camera again, go to the track 2, and select the empty. Now, something important to note here is that the track 2 and up values have to be specific. So you set this to the y-axis, and you set the 2 to -z. That way it looks through this axis. If you set it to z, it looks the other way. So -z, that's the way to go. Now you can basically follow the same approach as before. We could start from out here, right click, insert a keyframe. Then we go track 200 frames forward, 200 exactly. And then we go to the front, something like that, insert a keyframe. Now let's just switch the scene camera to camera 1. There we go. And now you can see the camera tracks a path, or it goes around the path that we specified while tracking to the empty. But the cool thing is you can actually start to play around with this and animate this. So if we go back to frame 0, hit G and Z, we'll pull this down. So let's say we'll start it down here, somewhere in his stomach. Then put up the transforms, insert a keyframe. So now this is keyframed here at frame 0. Take it to frame 200. And then we'll just do basically the reverse move of this. There we go, track up, right click, insert keyframe. And now we actually track and we have full control over where this is looking. Now you can start to do a lot of really crazy things with this, like adding rotation to make sort of like even more cinematic fly-throughs. You select your camera, go to the constraint. You want to make sure that target Z is enabled. That just means that if you rotate this empty, it'll actually track to it. So you can see right now nothing is happening. Go to the camera, target Z, and then once you rotate this, it actually starts to rotate. You could start out with, let's say, a value here of 0, and then once we get to the end point, we want to skew it a little bit or something like that. Maybe there, right click, insert a keyframe. So now we create a similar looking shot. Scale this up a little bit. A similar looking shot where we track through the gauntlet, but we end up in a skewed position looking at his face.
I think this is such a cool technique. The reason I like using this technique is because you have so much control and it's very procedural. You're really only animating a few channels. So if you get feedback on this, it's very easy to change it up and you can so easily create multiple revisions of it.
And it's much easier than having to mess around with a camera and then you sort of look through the camera, try to scroll in and out to get the exact zoom value that you want. Combining these two techniques with the path constraint and the track 2 constraint, I think that gives you the most freedom actually. And you can always, move this around, and this is basically always where your camera is going to be looking. So you could, move it out here, something like this, and then you could animate something, I don't know, from this part of the gauntlet down to this part of the gauntlet, and you would ensure that your camera is always looking in the correct spot basically.
What's also cool is that now we are using Eevee, which gives us, it looks great and we have a lot of really good performance with this. But if you want to really, get into the proper ray traced shadows and subsurface scattering, you can just switch this to cycles. And that means you have like all your like temporary play blasts you can send to comp and to an editor down the line. You can figure out all the editing for that, and then you can render out the final one once everything is approved and it looks really nice.
And one final note is the order of these constraints has to be like this. Your path constraint has to come before the track 2 constraint. If you don't do that, if this one is up here, for example, and let's see here, you can see that it actually sort of messes up. Blender, I don't know, there's like a bug in Blender, I think, where if you don't actually change any values, it'll still perform correctly, or incorrectly. So in this case, let's say you created the track 2 constraint before the path constraint. Even if you switch them, it'll still be messed up. But if you just quickly just pull down the influence and pull it back up, everything will be back to normal. So just keep that in mind. And I think with that about wraps it up. So if you want to see more videos like this in the future where we create more cool cinematic content inside of Blender or anything else Blender related really, let us know in the comment and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll get notified every time we put out a new video.
Thanks for watching, guys.
If you're looking for training or high quality assets, make sure to stop by the FlippedNormals marketplace. And if you're interested in supporting us by buying our merchandise, you can check that out in the description below.